Welcome to Dissecting Creativity, a series of interviews with contemporary thought leaders in the field of creativity. The purpose of these interviews is to examine the research being produced by these thought leaders, but more than that, it's also looking at their own creativity. In today's interview, we work with Dr. Teresa Amabile of the Harvard Business School. Dr. Amabile is a prolific creativity researcher, having published 3 books and over 150 papers and chapters in the field of creativity. Let's welcome Dr. Teresa Amabile to Dissecting Creativity. So, Teresa, I'm absolutely thrilled to have this time with you, and I'll thank you right from the very start for being willing to join us in this unique interview. As you know, the purpose is to hear in your own words your research and creativity, but more than that, it's an up-close and personal, as much as you're willing to divulge, about yourself, your creativity, and what has influenced you as your creativity has been shaped and so forth. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Gerard. I'm really delighted to be here and happy that you invited me. Well, I haven't done anything like this before, but I'm looking forward to it.
I'm glad we can give you that first-time experience. Mm-hmm. So, Teresa, where were you born?
I was born right here in Buffalo. In fact, I think it was probably about maybe a mile from here, the old Millard Fillmore Hospital at Gates Circle.
Yeah.
So very close by.
Well, welcome back to Buffalo.
Thank
then.
you. Buffalo, born and bred, yes.
So let's start by looking at your childhood. As you describe in your book, Growing Up Creative, you come from a large family, 5 sisters and a brother, is that right?
Yes.
I'd like to interview your brother.
Tom, are you here? I don't think Tom made it today, but yes, he was the oldest, followed by 6 sisters, and yeah.
I'm sure he has some tales to tell, yeah. Right. So what's interesting, in that book you describe the success, the adult achievements of your siblings, a doctor, professional writers, someone who was an accomplished cook, teachers in different languages and so forth. So can you talk about your childhood and the childhood home and how that influenced you and specifically your creativity?
I love my childhood. I should start by saying that. And I love being part of this huge Italian-American family. Your name is Italian.
It sure is, yes, yeah.
Right. So we had a very ethnic feeling to our family. My grandparents, all 4 of them were born in Italy and lived in Buffalo. We spent a lot of time with them. Childhood was a time when we focused on school and focused on family. And those were the two big elements that stand out for me as I think of those times. I actually grew up in North Tonawanda, which is one of the suburbs of Buffalo, and we focused on education, I think, in part because my parents had limited educational opportunities. They both grew up during the Depression and had aspirations for higher education, which just couldn't be fulfilled because of the difficult family circumstances they were in at that time. My mom actually wanted to come to Buff State. She wanted to be a teacher. Okay. And my dad had dreams of being a doctor when he was young, but neither of them could go for higher education. Okay. They wanted that for their children, though, clearly wanted that. And all 7 of us ended up with at least a bachelor's degree, and in fact, most of us have advanced degrees. There are, I've lost count, maybe 5 or 6 master's degrees in the family, and a couple of doctorate degrees. And I think we loved school because it was something that our parents loved. They were so excited by it. We would bring home a drawing or a spelling paper or something like that, and Mom would exclaim over it, and she would tape it to the kitchen cupboards. And it was clear that this was great. This was, Dad had his job, his work, his business that he ran. Mom had her work at home, and this was our thing. This was what we were doing, and we were proud of it.
Well, let's continue on the theme of school then, because you talked about the emphasis and the value placed on education. So what were your schooling experiences like? Where did you go to school? How did that impact or shape you? Stories on the positive side, or perhaps stories that were negative experiences that you were able to turn around?
We all have stories on both sides to
Yeah,
it, Gerard.
I'm sure. Yeah.
So I went to kindergarten in a public school called Wurlitzer School in North Tonawanda. I'm not sure if Wurlitzer School is still around, but it was wonderful.
Yeah.
I think it was, I went to kindergarten in the 1950s, and I think that this was pretty unusual for that time, but we had an open classroom kind of situation where there was a lot of free playtime. In fact, most of the kindergarten day was access to toys, to art materials, and I especially focused on the art materials. I loved it. I really wanted to spend a lot of time at the crayon table, and then we had these big easels where we could, paint, beautiful big pots of paint, huge paint brushes. Actually, as I'm saying this, I realize they probably weren't that big, but I was so small that they seemed
much
huge
larger.
to me. Yeah. But I loved spending time over there. And when I was a kid, in that kindergarten class, our teacher came to each of the homes for an end-of-the-year conference with our mothers. Most mothers were stay-at-home then. Most didn't have their own means of transportation. So our kindergarten teacher actually came to our homes. And I remember my beloved Mrs. Bollier. I couldn't say enough.
It's amazing you remember her name.
Yes, her name, all these years later. Mrs. Bollier was in the living room talking to my mom. I was, of course, eavesdropping from around the corner. And I remember hearing Mrs. Bollier say at one point, "I think Teresa shows a lot of potential for artistic creativity, and I hope that's something she develops over the years." That's kind of a flashbulb moment for me because I think it's the first time I heard the word creativity. First time I remember, anyway. I'm not sure I knew what it meant, but it sounded really good. The way she said it, it sounded like this is a good thing to have, and I was glad that I had it. And as I figured out what creativity meant, I started looking forward to a life as a creative artist.
Wow.
Right? I was very excited about this. Unfortunately, I only had 1 year in that school.
Okay.
The next year, my parents enrolled me in our parish school, St. Joseph's Elementary School in North Tonawanda. And it was a great school in many, many ways. It really was. But not for art. In fact, kindergarten was kind of the high point of my artistic career. I've really never done anything with art since that year. And I thought about that as I went through elementary school and high school. I thought, what happened to that promised artistic creativity? There are a couple of hypotheses here, right? One is that Mrs. Bollier was wrong. I didn't really have any spark for artistic creativity, but I prefer the alternative hypothesis, which is that there was something there, but it got stifled. It got killed in the years after kindergarten. So every year in elementary school, we had the same kind of crazy, weird activity given to us for art. We only had art once a week. So instead of being something that we did as part of the day, it became a subject that we had once a week. Friday afternoon, I think the nuns were too tired to do anything else with us at that time, so they said, okay, you're going to have art now. Exactly. And we had this activity given to us week after week where each of us would get a small reprint, like index card size, of one of the great masterworks in painting. I think this was meant for art appreciation. I wonder, did anybody else have an activity like that? I see some heads nodding in the audience. Okay. I don't know if it was a Buffalo thing or other places as well. I think it was meant for art appreciation, but that's not what our teachers did. They would tell us to take out our art materials and copy it. These were great masterworks. We had no skill training at all in art. I remember second grade, 8 years old, we had Da Vinci's Adoration of the Magi, right?
And fairly daunting.
Yeah, right. Okay, so 8-year-olds copy this. Spend an hour trying to copy this. What were our art materials? I don't know what you had in elementary school, but what we had was broken Crayola crayons and loose leaf paper. It was an exercise in frustration. I couldn't even figure out how to get all those horses and angels on the page, let alone make them look like horses and angels, right?
Yeah.
So mine were monstrosities, and it was very frustrating. More than that, we were very strictly graded on these things that we produced. And I really, I tried hard, but mine were terrible, and I was getting lousy grades on these. I was a good little student. I was accustomed to getting A's on everything. So
Yeah.
I just lost all of my motivation for creativity.
Well, as you tell
creativity in art,
Yeah.
at least.
Well, as you tell that story, it makes me think of the variables that you've looked at: restricted choice, expected evaluation, those extrinsic factors, which we'll talk a bit more about. You just alluded to how it affected you, so I want to focus on the personal impact. Can you harken back to its effect on you to make this shift and have this restricted choice and this evaluation and the negative feedback that came with that?
When I was in kindergarten, not only did I do art at school, but I loved it so much that I would come home and ask my mom to get out our art materials. And we didn't have much, but we had some little paints, and we had some crayons and various other craft materials. And I would spend my afternoons doing that very often because I just loved it so much. I lost all interest in art because of those experiences, I think, in elementary school. I didn't want to do it on my own. Yeah. It became aversive for me, actually. So I think that I just shrank back from artistic activities because of that. So that was a negative effect of schooling on my creativity. But there's really good news, because when I went to high school, I discovered science. I went to Bishop Gibbons High School in North Tonawanda, and I had a wonderful science teacher. Her name was Sister Felicia. She was my science teacher, I believe, for my first 3 years in high school. Earth science, then biology, then chemistry. I loved all of these sciences. I hadn't been exposed to science before. I was very excited about it. I went home and I would start doing little experiments when I took bio, I would do experiments with plants in the backyard or in the basement, and it was very exciting to realize that you could get answers to questions that maybe hadn't been asked before, or at least hadn't been asked by you before, in a very systematic way. I love this. So I was captivated by science. And I think that's when my creativity really began to flower again, when I discovered that subject matter.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. In terms of growing up creative, in your book, you tell a story about your own childhood. We've talked about school. I want to revert back to.
So it's been a while since I read the book, Gerard. I'm not sure what you're going to say here.
I'm building up to it. You tell a story about your own upbringing in the family environment in terms of encouraging creative thinking and so forth. And in the book, you tell a story about a contest, a jingle contest, in which jingles could be submitted, and the winning jingle, the winners would get a all expenses paid trip to Italy for 2. And you tell the story about how your parents got you involved in this competition. Yes.
So our parents got us involved in all kinds of wacky activities. And this wasn't so wacky, but it was, I think, pretty unusual. So one Sunday they sat all 7 of us down. This was after Sunday dinner in the afternoon. They said, "Okay, kids, we have a special activity today. There's a contest. The local newspaper's running this contest for an advertising jingle, and the winning jingle is going to win a trip for 2 to Europe." It wasn't just Italy. It was a trip for 2 to Europe, to several countries in Europe. All expenses paid. And Mom and Dad would really love to go on this trip. And you kids are good writers. And we were, most of us enjoyed writing a lot. So we thought it would be fun if everybody sat down and wrote a jingle this afternoon. And Mom and Dad will do it too, and then we'll send them all in. And if one of them wins, Mom and Dad are going to go on the trip, but wouldn't it be fun for our
So
family?
the incentive is to send Mom and Dad away? Was that the incentive?
Right, send Mom and Dad away. We thought it would be kind of cool to participate in this contest. So we did. We all wrote jingles, and my parents must have looked like very prolific jingle writers because 9 entries went in under my dad's name. And one of them won. One of them actually won. Now, I don't know how many people entered the contest. I've kind of wondered about that since, but one of ours was the winning entry, and my parents not only got a 2-week, all expenses paid trip to Europe, but they got to meet Pope John the 23rd. Wow. This was 1963. Actually, it was 62. Wow. And it was a phenomenal experience for them. And they brought us back gifts from Europe. It was exciting. Our picture was in the Buffalo Evening News.
Oh, gosh,
the family's picture, helping Mom and Dad pack the bags. Yeah, it was fun.
So you had an advantage. You had a very creative upbringing. You had parents who focused on education and the value of education. So the first book you write is all about growing up creative. And in a way, it's advice to parents and to teachers. What led you to write that book? What was your motivation behind that?
I had been doing research on kids' creativity since my graduate school days, since I first got interested in researching that as a topic. And I felt that I'd done some good work. I'd made some interesting discoveries about how kids' creativity can be destroyed. And it turns out that the things that can destroy kids' creativity are pretty common in schools, also pretty common in some home environments. So I decided that what I discovered would never be read by the people who could really use it. I was publishing in the psychology journals, you know, the child psychology journals, general psychology journals, which was what you need to do, you know, when you're a young academic. But parents weren't reading these, you know, teachers weren't reading these, and I decided I wanted to speak to them. I thought it would be an interesting challenge to try to write something in a way that would be accessible to everyday people, you know, not written for scholars. It was challenging, but I had a ball doing it. And I decided that I wanted to not only describe the research that I'd done, but also tell stories that would be compelling as examples of creativity being encouraged. So I was fortunate enough to be able to get an interview with the novelist John Irving. Have you read any of his books? He wrote The World According to Garp, Cider House Rules.
Saw the movie.
Yeah, right.
Maybe I should start reading more.
I've
seen a lot of movies.
Many of these were made into movies.
Yeah.
So he was willing to spend a day letting me interview him. I had read a little bit about his childhood, and it sounded to me like, you know, he had some really interesting things to say. It turned out that his parents gave him an unusual degree of autonomy when he was growing up. He was able to roam the small New England town where he grew up and explore and come home and tell stories to his parents about his day. I think he may have been an only child. He would tell them stories about his day that were lies. He was using his imagination, and they knew that these things couldn't have possibly happened to him. But he would elaborate on these, and his parents listened with rapt attention. And he knew and they knew that these were made-up stories, but they clearly enjoyed hearing these stories, and they encouraged him to use his imagination. And he played sports outside, but he also liked to spend a lot of time in his room, just daydreaming, looking out the window, and thinking things up that he would then tell them. And he said that's how he became a storyteller. That's how he came to love stories. In fact, that's how he came to feel compelled to tell stories and to want to get really good at it. Interestingly, John Irving is dyslexic, and he disclosed this to me when I interviewed him. He said it was very hard for him to read, and it was still a little bit difficult for him as an adult So the act of writing and reading was still quite effortful for him. The most effortful thing, of course, is coming up with these compelling stories that are bizarre yet somehow familiar, that people can resonate to. He feels that he's perfecting a craft, and he traces it back to that childhood experience. So that was just a wonderful part of working on Growing Up Creative. And I interviewed kids who were known to do creative things, interviewed their parents, visited their homes to find out, what was going on there, what was encouraging their creativity. I spent a lot of time hanging out with a couple of my daughter's elementary school teachers, who I thought were wonderful in encouraging her creativity. So I tried to make the research discoveries rich enough to really be used in the real world.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, and I think one of the talents that you have that I absolutely marvel at is your ability to write for various audiences. As you say, certainly the academic journals with 150 publications, but the motivation to and the skill to begin to translate this in a way that others, as you say, who should have this information can use it. And I have to tell you, when I read the book, I thought, this is a great guide for parents. All parents should read this, and I really appreciate your ability to tell stories, to bring this alive. And one of the comments that you make in the book is that this kind of focus on creativity development shouldn't just be for the few gifted prodigies. You make a very clear point that this is for all children. Do you still feel that way, and why do you think that's important?
I really do feel that way. And we scholars who study creativity define it as novelty that's appropriate, novelty that works, right? I think that every human with normal capacities has the capability to do something creative in their life. And some people have a great deal of capability to do creative things in many realms. It would be a shame to limit that to only maybe the top 1 or 2% of the population in intelligence or in special talents. Because the fact is, all of human progress depends on creativity. Depends on people doing things differently from the way they've been done before, but something that works, something that meets a goal or that expresses something that will mean something to other people. So to the extent that we can help everyone improve their creativity, we'll be doing a service to those individuals because they'll be able to lead fuller lives, and we'll certainly be doing a service to society. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree with that. That's why I do the work that I do in terms of trying to facilitate this skill in others and help them to discover that we all have this, that we came into the world with this creative talent, and because of circumstances that we come up against, schools, just socialization process, sometimes we get disconnected from it, as you said. Sometimes we come up against circumstances that kills rather than promotes our creativity. And clearly, our vision at the International Center for Studies in Creativity is to promote this around the world and to help people recognize that it's a life skill. And that the closing of your book really spoke to me, because that's the exact point that you made, that you said that when parents promote creativity in their children, they're giving them a gift for life. And I think you're alluding to that right now in terms of the value that it provides as you move through life and the complexity of life.
That's right. That's right. Can I tell you a little story about my dad?
Of course, yeah.
So as I said, my parents encouraged creativity in us kids, but they were creative themselves. So my dad, Charles Amabile, and my mom, Carmela Cumbo Amabile, both very creative people in their own way. My mom, in running the home, she was the original recycler. She, in the 1950s, we used something, it got used again and used again and used again, and it got repurposed when it was starting to wear out. She really taught us to respect everything that we had, everything in nature, to respect our own talents, our own gifts, and to do whatever we could with them. And she modeled that herself. Our dad was an entrepreneur. So he used his creativity in business. He and his brother started a food importing and packing business when they were quite young, and it grew, it thrived for, gosh, 60 years, I think, before it was sold.
Wow.
They crafted a life for themselves. Yeah. And my dad, I think, was particularly creative in coming up with new ideas for this business. So the food that they specialized in was condiments, olives, pickles, pepperoncini, giardiniera, things that are packed in brine. My dad loved to read, especially U.S. News and World Report. That was his thing, and he loved to read the Buffalo Evening News. So he would focus on those readings. He had very little time because he worked so hard at his job to grow this business, to make it succeed. But most evenings around the dinner table, he would try to engage us in conversation about something that he had read, something that he had seen, and ask us what our thoughts were on this. And he read an article. Now, you help me date this.
Okay.
He read an article, I think it was in the late 50s or early 60s. I'm going by how old I think I was at the time.
Okay.
An article that talked about this new thing called brainstorming that was being discovered and researched in Buffalo. So what
That would have
year-
been that time period.
Right,
Yeah,
it would
yeah.
have been like
yeah, it would have
late
been actively researched in the late 1950s, early 1960s.
Exactly.
Sure.
Well, he was thrilled to
Really?
hear about this. He taught us what brainstorming meant based on this article. He said, so kids, let's brainstorm. So
One of
I
the
don't remember
original-
what he gave us to brainstorm
One of the original
about.
facilitators.
One of the original
Wow.
facilitators, that's right. And I do remember around that time in their packing, their food packing facility, they had got some machines, some automated machines. And there was a creative problem that my dad was trying to solve. And he said, okay, kids, we're going to brainstorm about this. And the problem was that the pepperoncini, when they went into the jars through the automated machine, sometimes the stems of the pepperoncini would be sticking up, and the caps in the bottle capper couldn't go on straight. So they had a process problem there. He said, so, we've got to think about what we can do about this. So we brainstormed that for a while. And then a couple months later, my dad read something about laser beams. Laser was a new technology at that time. He thought this was really exciting, so he taught us about laser beams one night at dinner. He said, all right, let's brainstorm about laser beams. What can we think of that these things could be used for? And somebody at the table said, I know, they could just shave off those pepperoncini stems. Just zap them right off. It was a very novel idea, right? It was probably Dad, actually, who came up with that one. Novel idea, not so appropriate, not so fitting to use this, multi-million-dollar machine, high-tech, to take care of this rather low-tech problem.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing that went on at home. And that's the kind of activity that I hope parents will be inspired to do with their kids.
Well, I'm so thrilled to hear you say that, because we look at creativity as more than just a skill that belongs among the eminent creators, but an everyday life skill that helps us to deal with challenges and change in our lives. And I love the fact that your father was deliberately provoking creativity and using deliberate process. Those are great stories. So the next book you wrote was Creativity in Context. What brought you to that, and your famous componential model, which we all cite? So talk about that as well.
I have to thank you. You and your program are among my biggest boosters, so thank you very much for that. I wanted to write a book that would specifically aid creativity researchers, that would generate interest in creativity research, that would show that it had a very solid scientific footing, not just in my work, but in a lot of other research that was going on, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I thought there was a lot to capture, a lot to bring together to make a comprehensive statement about what we know about creativity, to explain this componential theory of creativity that I had come up with, and to show scholars how many more questions there were to be answered. So that was really my motivation. That book was really designed to speak to scholars and to get people interested in doing creativity research. It actually, creativity in context had an earlier incarnation that was actually earlier than Growing Up Creative. I wrote the first edition of the book as The Social Psychology of Creativity in 1983. And then I updated it in 1996 as Creativity in Context. So the scholarly book was actually the first book that I wrote. And then many years later, I incorporated a lot of the new research that had been done in doing that updated statement. Would it make sense for me to just spend a minute saying what the elements of the componential model are?
Yeah, please do.
I mean, I know you and your students know that, but there's some folks here who don't.
For the broader audience, sure, that would be valuable. Yeah.
So the idea is that creativity certainly depends on talent. And that I think was the received wisdom of most people who were thinking about creativity before the 1960s or so. Talent is only one component, though. And I call that the component of domain relevant skill, or in layperson's terms, expertise. It's a special ability to do something well in a particular area, a particular domain. Partly it's built in, but it can also be developed through education, through formal and informal experience in a domain, technical skill, knowledge, and so on. But there's a second really important component, and that's what I credit the Creative Studies program, the researchers who founded it, Sid Parnes, Ruth Knoller, and their colleagues, with doing so much to investigate and to promote. And that's what I call creativity relevant processes, or creativity skills. There are ways of thinking, ways of looking at the world that can enable people to use their talents, to use whatever skills they have in new ways, to come up with new ideas. That's a second component. And it's something that needs to be combined with that talent component. The third is really my contribution. That third component is intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is the drive to do something because you're passionate about it. It's the motivation to do something because you find it interesting, personally challenging, satisfying in some way. I found in my research, and this was really one of my first discoveries, that people are most creative when they're primarily intrinsically motivated, when they're motivated primarily by that interest, enjoyment, satisfaction, that personal sense of challenge in what they do. And the fourth component is actually something that's not inside the individual. It's the environment that the person is in. And I think that's what I was able to bring as a social psychologist, to say, yes, there's a lot inside the individual that's important, but the context that the individual is in makes a huge difference. That's why the work environment is so important. That's why the home environment and the school environment are so important.
Well, let's take that model and let's turn it back on you. And
Me again.
Really, it's all about you. This interview is all about you. So what motivates you? Where do you get that intrinsic drive where you lose yourself in that moment, that task?
Losing yourself, that's another way of talking about the flow experience, which our colleague Mike Csikszentmihalyi has talked about so much. Wow. There are a number of things that give me that experience of being lost in what I'm doing. When I'm coming up with ideas for research, when I'm designing research studies, either by myself or with my close collaborators, with my students, I have that experience, right? that I'm lost in something wonderful. I'm really wrapped up in it. When I'm reading something that's captivating, often in my field, but sometimes in an entirely different field, I can get that sense as well. Actually, looking at the data can be very exciting for me as well. And writing it up. A lot of people don't enjoy writing. I love to write. That doesn't mean it's easy. Like my good friend John Irving, the novelist, I can say it's very, very hard work. But I love doing it. I love thinking about how I can craft ideas, put them together in a way that will, first of all, make sense to me, but but then we'll speak to other people. We'll tell a coherent story from what I think I've discovered.
Yeah. Well, speaking of writing, that's just a great segue into the latest book that I've fallen in love with, The Progress Principle.
Thank you.
I have to tell you, I am really struck by the stories that are in here. And even more so, the amount of data that you culled through. Almost 12,000 diary entries to get at the inner work life. So can you talk a bit about the Progress Principle, what that is, what led to this book?
Yes. Well, Gerard, the research that we were just talking about a moment ago, the earlier research that I did, looked at the aspects of the social environment that could influence people's motivation and creativity. So that early work discovered that when people were in creativity supporting environments, and there were certain aspects of that, they were more intrinsically motivated in their work. They were able to focus on what they were most passionate about, and that led them to be more creative. And when they were in environments that did not have these creativity stimulants but had obstacles instead, their motivation to do their work creatively decreased. That intrinsic motivation drained away and creativity suffered. So I had a sense of the fact that the work environment was important,
Sure.
that motivation was important, but I didn't feel I really understood what it was like for people who were trying to be creative day by day, what it was like for them to do that creative work in the workplace. I wanted to understand really what makes people happy, motivated, productive, and most of all, creative every day at work. That's why I undertook the research that led to the Progress Principle. Because, you know, working adults spend more time at work than any other single activity. And it's something that's really important for us to understand, and I don't think we understand it yet.
Yeah.
So that was my desire in undertaking that research. I knew that it was going to be really hard to understand what was going on inside people's hearts and minds every day at work. That's why I came up with this diary method that you mentioned. So my colleagues and I have to call out one particular colleague. My husband, Stephen Kramer, if you'd hold up that book, his name is on there. Steve was my closest collaborator in this research and certainly in writing the book. We had many, many other collaborators, doctoral students and scholarly colleagues as well. We decided that the only way we could truly understand what was really going on inside people's hearts and minds was to use a method that had been pioneered by Csikszentmihalyi in his experience sampling method, and that was to ask people every day to send us a confidential electronic daily diary about their workday. Now, Csikszentmihalyi had people carry around a beeper with them for a couple of weeks, and every time they were beeped, he had them take out a questionnaire from the packet of questionnaires he sent them. So this was kind of a high-tech version of that. But instead of doing it for 2 weeks, we asked people who were doing creative work inside companies to do this for us every day during the entire course of a project that they were working on. From the first day of the project to the last day. On average, that was 4.5 months for most people who participated in our research. That's how we ended up with so many diaries. We had 238 professionals working in 26 creative project teams in 7 companies in 3 industries send us daily diaries during the entire course of a project that they were working on. And this gave us a fascinating inner look. This was a treasure trove of data, fascinating inner look at what they were actually experiencing every day. Their companies didn't see these diaries. Our research team was the only group that saw these diaries, and they were very honest with us. And you know, from that book, Gerard, some of these stories are heartbreaking.
They are, yeah.
People trying to do inventive work, trying to come up with new products for their company. These people were doing the most important innovation work of their companies, and it was sometimes being stifled by team leaders or by higher level managers who didn't understand the simplest things about setting up an appropriate environment to support progress, to support creativity. So the first discovery we made when we went through these diaries, and the diaries, by the way, didn't only ask people, tell us about what happened today. We asked them, write about one thing that stands out in your mind from the day. Tell us in as much detail as you can what happened, who was involved. We also asked them on the diary form to indicate their emotions that day and their motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and their perceptions of their work environment, just with a short survey with scale-rated questions. So we had quantitative data as well on what was going on. We also had separate performance data on all of these individuals. So we knew by getting measures from their colleagues and their supervisors, we knew how well these people were performing in their work. And the first discovery we made was one that we call the inner work life effect. So inner work life is not only motivation, but it's also emotion and perceptions. It's what people are thinking, what judgments they're making, what sense they're making of what's going on with them at work. It's also the emotions that they're experiencing as events of unfold, and it's their motivation, intrinsic or extrinsic, for their work. And we found that on those days and those weeks and those months, when people are having the most positive inner work life experience, that is, when they're having the most positive emotions, the strongest intrinsic motivation, and the most positive perceptions of their colleagues and their organization, that's when they're most likely to be creative in their work and productive and committed to their work and better colleagues to each other. All 4 performance dimensions are better when people are experiencing better inner work life.
Well, I really appreciate the science behind that. And I would highlight that in the book, the connection between the stories, because you really bring this alive. And what's really astounding to me is that, and of course I'm influenced by my own field and my own understanding of psychology and creativity, and I read this, and the stories in here almost shock my imagination. You tell the story about a company that was producer of kitchen gadgets and consumer goods that went from being most innovative in their industry under a new management team in 4 years going out of business, and telling the stories. And it shocks me when I read these. I think, okay, we've been studying leadership for 100 years. We've had MBA programs for how long? And you really underscore the gap between what managers think motivates employees and how off it is from what really motivates employees. So I'm going to ask you to comment on that briefly, and then we're going to open it up to the studio audience. So
absolutely,
you really highlight that gap.
Yeah, managers think that what motivates people is money and recognition and not getting in trouble at work, so, doing what you're told. Those are all extrinsic motivators. And yes, they do motivate people. But they are not the strongest motivators. What we discovered when we delved into these diaries was that of everything that happens on the best days, and I mean the days when people are most strongly intrinsically motivated in their work and doing their most creative work, the single most important thing is simply making progress in work they care about. That's why we call it the progress principle. What managers need to do is set up the conditions that will facilitate people being able to move forward in work they care about. So show them why their work matters, how it's contributing to something meaningful, and then give them the resources they need, give them the time they need, give them the clear goals and the autonomy they need to be able to use their minds, their creative abilities to make a difference.
Well, that's wonderful advice, and this will be more rhetorical. So how do we begin to inculcate future managers and current managers with that kind of skill set and attitude? But on that thought, we have asked the studio audience to capture some of their questions. I've had a couple of colleagues who've looked through those questions, and we'll take about 10 minutes to have others pose questions to you, and we'll turn it to Dr. Cindy Burnett.
Thank you. We have 3 questions from the audience. The first is, what advice would you give to our creativity students who are just starting out in the field?
Wow. I would say find a question that no one has answered yet. Grab onto it and try to figure out how to answer it. There's much more that we don't know about creativity than there is that we do know about creativity.
Thank you. Which of your thoughts and beliefs on creativity have changed over time, and what led to that change?
Why, that's a great question. You know, I've talked about intrinsic motivation. That's the motivation to do something because you're passionate. The opposite of intrinsic motivation is extrinsic motivation, and that is being motivated by money, by concerns about how you're going to be evaluated, by wanting to get ahead, by competition, and so on. And I use the word opposite just there intentionally. I used to think that they only worked in opposition. So my initial theory of creativity said that as extrinsic motivation becomes more prominent in someone's mind, their intrinsic motivation will necessarily decrease. And that does happen under many circumstances. So we talked about my elementary school experiences with art. As the evaluation pressure built up and the frustration built up and the concerns about, you know, how I was going to get graded, my intrinsic motivation definitely decreased. It was sort of a hydraulic model. But I discovered as I continued my research that there are certain kinds of extrinsic motivation that can actually add to intrinsic motivation rather than decreasing it. And this follows on some wonderful work that's been done by Edward Deasy and Richard Ryan at the University of Rochester. And that is that if people get an extrinsic reward that enables them to do more of what they love doing, that's not going to undermine their intrinsic motivation. So I discovered one company where scientists were rewarded in part by a ceremony, you know, for great work that they had done, but they were also rewarded by being given additional resources for their next project and being given additional autonomy in shaping that next project and what it would be. That was incredibly motivating. Now that was a kind of extrinsic motivator. You know, we're going to give you more resources, but it enabled them to do what they were so excited about doing. And that's what we call synergistic extrinsic motivation. So that was, for me, a sea change in my view of how creativity operated.
Thank you. And finally, how do you see the future of creativity?
The future of creativity.
There's a small question.
Wow, that's
Dawn.
a small, just a little question. Yeah. And that can be taken a few ways. The future of creativity research, or the future of creativity in the world. I think humans are never going to stop being creative. Sometimes they're creative in evil and destructive ways, and that's a whole other topic, and an important one for research, I think, that creativity by itself is valueless. It has to be connected to a value system. Ideally, people will always continue to be creative in a positive way as well. The future of creativity research, I don't know, Gerard, I'm sure that you've got your own ideas on this. I think some of the most exciting arenas for creativity research in the future are looking at cross-cultural differences. A lot of what we know, or a lot of what we think we know about creativity, is based in research that was done in Western societies, and usually the US and Canada, North American populations.
Sure, yeah.
And we assume, yes, everybody in the world is like us. Well, no, not so much. And, you know, I suspect that, in fact, I'm pretty sure that the intrinsic motivation principle of creativity will work a little bit differently in societies that are more communally oriented rather than individualistically oriented, such as ours. So I think in Asia, for example, in some of the more communal societies there, what intrinsically motivates people for creativity may be more of something like what's of interest to the group, not just what am I interested in particular.
Sure. Yeah, good observation. So we've got a little bit of time left. I'm going to ask you a few more questions. And the first one will be sort of a creativity exercise. And I'll set it up with posing a problem, at least my observation of a potential problem. So many reports come out now from educational leaders and business leaders where you see lists of skills that are necessary to be professionally successful. And in almost every list I see, there's creativity, creative problem solving, innovation. And then we have current trends in our education system and where that's going. So I'm going to give you some power. You're going to be the czar of education in the US.
Okay.
So given your knowledge about creativity, given what you've written about in terms of strategies and advice, you were once a 7th grade teacher. What would you recommend? What would you do? What would you put in place as a policy or strategies or recommendations if you were the czar of education and thinking about preparing young children as they go through their education process, preparing them for a world that's increasingly more complex, looking for innovative thinkers, looking for creative problem solvers who are joining the workforce? What would you do? And be playful, because you're the czar.
How much time do we have, Gerard?
You've got a couple, yeah, and you have a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I've got all right, so I just have to, my first playful thing is to not answer the question that you just asked. I will get to it. Yeah. I want to comment, you're right. When you see job descriptions now, they very often include creativity, innovation skill. Think about it, Gerard. We didn't see that 25 years ago.
It's a significant
change. So that is
a positive change.
That is a big positive, and I believe that it's due in large part to the work that you and your colleagues have done, the work that my colleagues and I have done, and the other creativity researchers out there, as well as the people who are using our research, bringing it as consultants to people in business. Everyone now, I believe, recognizes the importance of this. It's not like the days when I told my dissertation advisors that I wanted to study creativity, and they said, "Oh, please don't." I mean, we believe that you can do a good job at anything you want to study, but really that doesn't have a good reputation at all. There's not much good work done. Well, now there is a lot of good work done, right? The main thing that I would do if I had control over the education system would be to stop this trend of teaching to the tests. I think it has destroyed more creativity than anyone realizes. It's destroyed the creativity of children who are being focused on very specific approaches that will give them right answers on the tests that they have to take to prove that the school is doing what it's supposed to be doing. And it's destroying the creativity of the teachers who go into their classroom more and more demoralized every year because they realize that there are more and more requirements being placed on them to funnel the kids' learning in particular directions. Of course, it's important for kids to be literate and to be able to do basic math and to know basic science. But there are many ways that that can be done. And to think that it all has to be done in one mold is wrong. I would like to see a return to my kindergarten classroom of the 1950s. We should resurrect Mrs. Bollier, who passed away several years ago. I believe that we really could do something with the open classroom environment because I have seen it happening, Gerard, in Peru. Look up Innova Schools. I believe that if you Google it, you'll be able to find out about it. This is a new school system that's being started in one of the poorest countries in this hemisphere, with one of the poorest education systems on the globe. It's actually being run as a private company. These are wonderful schools, open classroom situations where kids learn from each other as well as from teachers. They are all learning English as well as learning Spanish. The way this is done for low cost. It's a tuition that low to middle income parents can afford. The way it's done is to use technology. So this is open classroom for the 21st century, right? Where the kids will often work in very large groups. Well, they're small groups, but in a room that maybe has 60 or 80 kids, and only 2 teachers who are roaming around, because the kids all have laptops and they're all getting instruction online. They're using Khan Academy for one thing, which is in English, and they thought, well, these kids are native Spanish speakers. Some of them have English skills, some of them don't. They're learning English in part by watching Khan Academy for their math lessons, but they're also helping each other to figure it out, and they're using Google Translate to figure out the lessons. They're doing this on their own with some help from the teachers, with a lot of help from each other. This is learning at its best. They're learning English, they're learning math, and they're learning how to teach each other.
So the teachers in this location, in this context, are facilitating, and the students are able to follow what's meaningful for them, and it's tapping into that intrinsic motivation that you were describing earlier.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
and there's time devoted every day to innovative thinking. So they actually use many of the principles that you teach here to have kids explore, come up with new ideas.
Well, I appreciate that response. And maybe someday you will be the czar of education. We'll have to work on that because I like your answer. So the last question, and we've got a minute here to wrap up. The last question is about you, because this is all about you. It's your interview. So what's next for you? What are you passionate about? What's on the horizon for you? What can we be looking forward to in terms of what you'll be paying attention to and producing?
I'm exploring that right now. 2 things strike me, and they both come from the progress principle research. One thing that we discovered was that many of the people who participated in the study, at the end of the study, told us that keeping a daily diary was a pain at first, the first couple of weeks, but then they kind of got into it and realized that they were learning things about themselves, and they were learning things about their work that they never would have seen otherwise. So one research stream I'm getting interested in is looking at the potential power of daily reflection on one's work and one's life. What impact might it have to focus on what progress you've made each day? So that's one thing I want to look at. The other is to look at the meaningfulness of work. What does work mean to people? How do they derive meaning from their work? What are the varieties of meanings that people get? What does that add to their work? And what does it add to their life?
That's powerful. That's actually one of the many questions I wasn't able to ask you, is how people go after finding meaning in their lives. I see a great symmetry between growing up creative and the progress principle in terms of a theme that runs across all of this is finding your meaning. Not what others determine the meaning should be for you, but for you to find that. So I think that's a very fruitful area to pursue. I want to thank you for joining our Dissecting Creativity interview, and I want to say to those of you that are watching that if you want to learn more about the International Center for Studies in Creativity, our programs and resources such as other videos, I encourage you to visit our website at Buffalo State. Thank you for joining us.